Somewhere in the frozen mud south of Rome, in early 1944, a German corporal woke up screaming, not because of a shell blast, not because of a tank rolling over his foxhole, but because a hand had just peeled back his blanket in total darkness and left something on his chest. When he struck a match, shaking so hard the flame nearly died, he found a small sticker pressed against his uniform, right over his heart. The words on it were printed in neat German. Das dicke Ende kommt noch. The worst is yet to come. His sentry was gone. Not captured, not wounded, simply gone, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The only trace was a thin smear of crimson on the sandbags and the faint smell of boot polish hanging in the winter air. By morning, every man in his platoon had requested a transfer away from the Anzio front, and their commanding officer did not blame them, because he had already filed the same request 2 days earlier. This was not an isolated incident, and it was not a ghost story passed around by superstitious conscripts. This was a calculated, repeatable, industrial-scale campaign of psychological destruction, waged by a unit so savage, so relentless, and so utterly unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever encountered, that German intelligence officers began classifying them not as a military formation, but as a terror weapon. Their official name was the 1st Special Service Force. The Germans called them Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. And the most shocking detail of all, the detail that Hollywood has spent 80 years trying to bury, is that roughly half of these so-called demons were Canadian volunteers who had been hunting moose and trapping beaver in the forests of Alberta and British Columbia, just 18 months before they started hunting SS officers in the mountains of Italy. But the terror at Anzio was only the final act of a much longer, much darker story. To understand how polite, hockey-loving Canadians became the single most feared close combat unit on the entire Western Front, you have to go back to the moment when the Allied war machine ground to a halt in the worst terrain in Europe, and the generals in Washington and London realized that all their tanks, all their bombers, and all their fresh-faced American draftees could not crack a single fortified mountain ridge held by battle-hardened German paratroopers. That was the moment someone decided to unleash something different, something primal, something that did not fight like an army, but hunted like a wolf pack in the dead of a Canadian winter night. And that decision changed the war. The Italian front in late 1943 was a catastrophe that the Allied propaganda machine worked overtime to disguise. The grand strategy had sounded brilliant in the conference rooms of Quebec and Cairo. Knock Italy out of the war, tie down German divisions, and open a southern road to the Reich. The reality on the ground was a nightmare of biblical proportions. The German commander, Field Marshal Kesselring, had turned the Italian peninsula into a fortress that made the trenches of the First World War look like a playground. His masterpiece was the Gustav Line, a chain of fortifications stretching from coast to coast across the narrowest part of Italy, anchored on mountains, rivers, and medieval stone towns that had been designed to resist siege warfare since the 12th century. Every ridge was mined. Every valley was pre-sighted for artillery. Every road was booby-trapped. The Americans threw everything they had at it. The 36th Infantry Division, composed mostly of Texas National Guardsmen, attempted to cross the Rapido River in January of 1944 and was virtually annihilated. Over 2,000 casualties in 48 hours, with entire companies wiped out before they could even reach the far bank. The British fared no better. Their 5th Division spent weeks grinding forward through mud so deep that tanks sank to their turrets, and soldiers described the landscape as looking like the surface of the moon after a flood. The French Expeditionary Corps, tough colonial troops from North Africa, made some progress in the mountains, but at a cost so staggering that their commander privately told his superiors the offensive was consuming his men faster than France could replace them. The problem was not courage. The problem was not equipment. The problem was that the Gustav Line was designed to neutralize exactly the kind of warfare that the Allies did best: massive firepower, air superiority, and armored breakthrough. In the mountains of central Italy, bombers could not find targets hidden in caves and stone farmhouses. Tanks could not climb goat trails. And the standard infantry tactics taught at Fort Benning and Sandhurst, which relied on fire and movement across open ground, were suicidal against an enemy dug into granite above you, who could see every step you took. The Allies needed something the textbooks did not teach. They needed men who could climb cliffs in the dark, fight at arm's length with edged weapons, and endure conditions that would break a normal infantry battalion within a week. But that is not what they were about to get from the replacement depots in Naples. What they got instead came from a decision made more than a year earlier, in the summer of 1942, by a British inventor named Geoffrey Pike, who had proposed one of the most insane military schemes of the entire war. Pike wanted to create a force of elite commandos who would parachute into Nazi-occupied Norway, strap on skis, and destroy hydroelectric dams, factories, and rail lines behind enemy lines, surviving for months in the Arctic wilderness without resupply. The plan was called Project Plough, and it was so outlandish that the only officer in the entire Allied command structure willing to take it seriously was an aggressive American colonel named Robert Frederick, a man who had never led troops in combat, but who possessed an almost pathological inability to say the word impossible. Frederick was given permission to recruit a force of roughly 1,600 men, drawn equally from the American and Canadian armies. The concept was simple on paper: combine American industrial resources and aggressive spirit with Canadian wilderness expertise and cold weather survival skills. The result, on paper, would be the most versatile special operations unit the world had ever seen. The reality of recruitment, however, immediately revealed a fault line that would define the unit's character for the rest of the war. The Canadian military took Project Plough seriously. They handpicked volunteers from across the country, selecting men with specific skills that no training camp could teach. Lumberjacks from British Columbia, who could navigate by starlight through old-growth forest. Trappers from northern Alberta, who could move through snow without leaving a visible trail. Miners from Sudbury and Timmins, who understood explosives the way a surgeon understands a scalpel. Hunters from the Maritimes, who could put a bullet through a playing card at 300 yards and skin a deer in under 4 minutes. These were not soldiers who had been taught to fight. These were men who had been fighting the land itself for their entire lives, and the land had been a far more merciless opponent than any German conscript. The American side of the recruitment was a different story entirely. The U.S. Army in 1942 was expanding at a rate that strained every institution in the country, and few commanders were willing to part with their best men for a harebrained Norwegian ski raid that would probably never happen. What Frederick got, in many cases, were the soldiers nobody else wanted. Brawlers from the stockade, disciplinary problems from infantry divisions that were happy to dump their troublemakers on someone else's roster, men who had been court-martialed, demoted, or earmarked for discharge. The American contingent of the 1st Special Service Force was, by the standards of the regular army, a collection of misfits and delinquents who were one bar fight away from a dishonorable discharge. And this is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because when you put Canadian wilderness predators in a barracks with American street fighters and tell them they are now a single unit, the result is not instant brotherhood. The result is war. The FSSF assembled at Fort William Henry Harrison, a dusty, isolated post near Helena, Montana, in the summer of 1942, and the friction was immediate, visceral, and violent. The Canadians looked at the Americans and saw undisciplined amateurs who could not read a map, could not start a fire without matches, and could not march 10 miles without complaining. The Americans looked at the Canadians and saw smug, provincial hicks who thought knowing how to gut a fish made them superior soldiers. Fist fights broke out in the mess hall within the first week. By the end of the first month, the base hospital was treating more casualties from inter-unit brawls than from training injuries. Colonel Frederick watched this chaos with what his staff described as unsettling calm. He did not crack down. He did not separate the national contingents. Instead, he made a decision that was either genius or madness. He mixed the Canadians and Americans together at the lowest possible level, assigning them to the same squads, the same tents, the same two-man foxholes. If you were a Canadian lumberjack from Prince George, your battle buddy was an American ex-convict from Detroit, and you were going to share a sleeping bag with him on a mountainside in -30, whether you liked it or not. But the real catalyst was not proximity. The real catalyst was pain. Frederick designed a training program that was, by the standards of 1942, borderline criminal. The men trained with live ammunition from day one. They made parachute jumps at altitudes so low that a 3-second delay in opening the chute meant a closed casket. They practiced hand-to-hand combat with actual knives, and the medics stitched up dozens of slashing wounds every week. They ran obstacle courses rigged with real explosives. They marched through the Montana wilderness in winter conditions that sent the thermometer to -40, sleeping in snow caves and eating whatever they could trap or forage. Men who could not keep up were not reassigned to a desk job. They were simply returned to their original units with a note that said unsuitable, which in the hyper-masculine culture of the wartime military was a brand of shame worse than a court-martial. The attrition rate was staggering. Roughly 40% of the original recruits washed out or were injured badly enough to require permanent reassignment. But the men who survived the training discovered something that no lecture on Allied unity could have taught them. When you are hanging from a cliff face at midnight in a blizzard, the nationality of the man holding your rope does not matter. When you are crawling through a live minefield with tracer rounds cracking over your head, the accent of the voice whispering directions in your ear is irrelevant. The FSSF did not become a brotherhood because of speeches or flags. It became a brotherhood because Frederick systematically destroyed every other identity his men had, national, personal, social, and replaced it with a single, all-consuming identity, Forceman. And the Forcemen were about to get a weapon that would become the symbol of everything they represented. The V-42 stiletto was not a knife in any conventional sense. It was a killing instrument designed with a single, specific purpose: to end a human being as quickly and quietly as possible. Developed by the Case Knife Company under Colonel Frederick's direct specifications, the V-42 had a 7-inch double-edged blade with a needle-sharp point that could penetrate a steel helmet. Its handle was wrapped in stacked leather washers for a sure grip even when slick with fluid, and its crossguard was ground to a thumbprint shape that allowed the user to apply maximum downward force. Most combat knives of the era were designed as utility tools that could also be used in a fight. The V-42 was designed for exactly one scenario: a man sneaking up behind another man in total darkness and driving a blade into the base of his skull. Every Forceman carried one. Every Forceman trained with it until the draw and strike sequence was as automatic as blinking. And every Forceman understood that the V-42 was not a weapon of last resort. It was the primary instrument of their trade, because in the kind of warfare Frederick was preparing them for, a gunshot was a failure. A gunshot meant you had been detected. A gunshot meant the mission was compromised. The knife was silence, and silence was survival. The irony was bitter. Project Plough, the grand Norwegian sabotage scheme that had justified the creation of the FSSF, was cancelled in the summer of 1943, before the unit ever set foot in Scandinavia. The reason was strategic. The Allies decided that a conventional invasion of Norway was no longer necessary, and the resources earmarked for Plough were redirected to the Mediterranean. 1,600 of the most intensively trained special operators in the Allied arsenal were now a unit without a mission, and the War Department briefly considered simply disbanding them. Frederick fought the disbandment with the same ferocity he brought to everything else. He lobbied, he argued, he called in favours, and he won. The FSSF would be sent to Italy, to the one front where conventional tactics had completely failed and where the brass was desperate enough to try anything. The ski commandos of Project Plough were about to be reborn as mountain assault troops, and their first target was a piece of terrain so forbidding that it had already broken 3 American infantry regiments. Monte la Difensa was not a mountain in the romantic alpine sense. It was a jagged 1,000-metre fist of rock jutting out of the Camino hill mass along the western sector of the Gustav Line, and it controlled the only viable road from Naples to Rome. The Germans had fortified the summit with machine gun nests, mortar pits, and an elaborate system of stone sangars that turned every boulder into a miniature fortress. 3 separate assaults by the 3rd Infantry Division and the 36th Infantry Division had been thrown back with heavy casualties, and the divisional commanders had privately told 5th Army Headquarters that the mountain was impassable by direct assault. The only approach that was not covered by overlapping fields of fire was the north face, a near-vertical cliff of loose shale and wet rock that rose 600 metres from the valley floor. Military intelligence had classified this approach as not feasible for formed bodies of troops. Robert Frederick looked at that classification and smiled. On the night of December 2nd, 1943, the 1st Special Service Force began climbing the north face of Monte la Difensa in freezing rain. There were no ropes fixed in advance. There was no artillery preparation to soften the defences, because any barrage would have alerted the Germans that an attack was coming from the impossible direction. The men climbed in single file, in total darkness, carrying full combat loads of weapons, ammunition, grenades, and rations. The shale was so loose that every handhold threatened to crumble, and the rain had turned every ledge into a waterfall. Men slipped and fell, some tumbling dozens of metres before catching a rock or a tree root. The medics who followed the column could do nothing for them in the dark, except mark their positions for later retrieval. It took 6 hours to reach the assault position just below the summit. 6 hours of climbing a cliff in the dark, in the rain, in December, with 60 pounds of gear, knowing that at any moment a German sentry could look over the edge and a single flare would turn the entire force into targets silhouetted against bare. Rock with no cover and no retreat. The fact that not a single man was detected during the ascent remains one of the most extraordinary feats of stealth in the history of modern warfare, and it was accomplished not by technology or intelligence breakthroughs, but by the sheer physical ability of men who had spent their lives climbing, hunting, and surviving in the Canadian wilderness. At 06:30 on December 3rd, the forcemen rolled over the lip of the summit and crashed into the German positions from the one direction nobody was watching. The fight for the summit of Monte la Difensa lasted approximately 2 hours. Military historians have struggled to reconstruct the exact sequence of events because the action was so chaotic, so close range, and so fast that the usual frameworks of tactical analysis simply do not apply. What is known is that the forcemen attacked with grenades and V-42 stilettos before most of the German defenders even knew they were under assault. The initial penetration of the German perimeter was accomplished almost entirely with bladed weapons because Frederick had ordered his men to hold fire until the element of surprise was lost. In the first minutes of the assault, the fighting was hand-to-hand in the most literal sense. Men grappling in foxholes, in the rain, in near total darkness, with nothing between them and their enemy except a 7-inch blade. The Germans on Monte la Difensa were not rear echelon clerks. They were troops from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, experienced soldiers who had been fighting in Italy for months and who occupied prepared defensive positions with clear fields of fire in every direction except the one the forcemen came from. They were overwhelmed not by superior numbers or firepower, but by the sheer violence and speed of the assault. Survivors from the German garrison later told interrogators that they believed they were being attacked by a force at least 3 times the actual size of the FSSF element, because they could not comprehend that a single battalion-sized unit could generate that volume of close-quarters aggression. The 1st Special Service Force took Monte la Difensa in a fraction of the time that 3 conventional infantry regiments had failed to take it. The cost was significant. The force suffered roughly 77 casualties in the initial assault, with the number climbing in the days that followed as the Germans counterattacked repeatedly. But the strategic result was decisive. The capture of Defensa cracked the western anchor of the Gustav Line in that sector and forced the Germans to redraw their entire defensive scheme. And that was only the beginning, because after Defensa, the brass realized they had something unprecedented on their hands. A unit that could do what no other formation in the Allied order of battle could do. The FSSF was immediately fed into one impossible mission after another, taking Monte la Remetanea, Monte Samucro, and a string of other fortified peaks that had stalled the Fifth Army advance for weeks. The forcemen climbed, fought, bled, and kept climbing. And with every mountain they took, the legend grew a little darker and a little more terrifying to the men on the other side. But the mountains were just the proving ground for what came next. In late January of 1944, the Allies launched Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio, south of Rome, designed to outflank the Gustav Line and force the Germans to retreat. The plan was supposed to be a masterstroke. Instead, it became one of the most notorious debacles of the European War. The American commander, Major General John Lucas, landed his forces successfully, but then hesitated, choosing to consolidate the beachhead rather than push inland. The Germans, under Kesselring's ruthless direction, poured reinforcements into the hills surrounding Anzio and pinned the Allied force in a shallow, flat perimeter that was exposed to artillery fire from 3 sides. For weeks, the beachhead was a shooting gallery. Soldiers lived in waterlogged foxholes, under constant shelling, with no room to maneuver and no way to break out. Morale collapsed. Casualties mounted. The press began calling Anzio a second Gallipoli. The 1st Special Service Force arrived at Anzio in February of 1944 and was assigned to the most exposed, most dangerous sector of the entire perimeter. The right flank along the Mussolini Canal, a flat, featureless stretch of reclaimed marshland with no natural cover, and a front line so close to the German positions that soldiers on both sides could hear each other cough. The sector was considered a quiet but miserable posting by the conventional units that had held it, a place where the main enemy was boredom, mud, and the occasional sniper round. The forcemen changed the rules within 48 hours. Frederick did not believe in static defense. He did not believe in holding the line. He believed in domination, in making the enemy so terrified of your sector that he pulled his best troops away from it and reinforced the quiet zones instead. And the tool he used to achieve this domination was the night raid. Every single night, without exception, teams of forcemen would cross the canal, infiltrate the German lines, and wreak havoc. The tactics were refined to a science of terror. The raiders blackened their faces and hands with shoe polish, turning themselves into shadows that were virtually invisible in the darkness. They moved in small teams of 6 to 12 men, communicating with hand signals and pre-arranged whistle codes. They carried V-42 stilettos, grenades, and Thompson submachine guns, but the guns were for emergencies only. The preferred method was the knife. The raids followed a pattern that was designed not just to inflict casualties, but to systematically destroy the psychological resilience of every German unit opposite them. A team would cross the canal, locate a German outpost, and eliminate the sentries silently with blades. Then they would enter the position and select targets. An officer sleeping in a dugout, a radio operator at his set, a machine gun crew dozing beside their weapon. Some they would eliminate quietly. Others they would leave alive, deliberately, intentionally, with a sticker pressed to their helmet or their forehead, bearing the emblem of the FSSF and the words "Das dicke Ende kommt noch." The worst is yet to come. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers in the Anzio sector began refusing to sleep. Sentries demanded to be posted in pairs, then in threes, then refused to stand watch at all. Units that had held their positions calmly under artillery bombardment began breaking down under the stress of not knowing whether they would wake up with a knife at their throat or a sticker on their face. German intelligence reports from the period describe the FSSF's tactics in language that borders on the supernatural. They reference phantom patrols and ghost soldiers, and warn that the unit opposite the Mussolini Canal is not a standard military formation. And this is where the name was born. The German soldiers at Anzio began calling the men who came for them in the darkness Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils, not because of any official designation, not because of propaganda, but because that was the only language that matched what they were experiencing. When you cannot see your enemy, when he comes and goes like smoke, when he can reach you in your sleep and choose whether you live or cease to exist, when the only evidence of his presence is a sticker and a missing comrade, the word soldier is no longer adequate. You reach for something older, something from the part of the human brain that still remembers what it felt like to be prey. The sticker campaign was not a spur-of-the-moment trick. It was a deliberate, authorized tactic that Frederick himself encouraged, and it was based on a sophisticated understanding of combat psychology that was decades ahead of its time. The stickers served multiple purposes simultaneously. First, they told the enemy that the forcemen had been inside his defenses and could have eliminated everyone but chose not to, which destroyed the fundamental assumption of military security, that your position is defensible. Second, they spread uncertainty, because a soldier who finds a sticker on his body does not know how many others were visited the same night, creating a multiplier effect where a single raid could paralyze an entire battalion. Third, and most insidiously, they forced the German command to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive security, tying down troops in guard duty and patrol rotations that would otherwise have been used to attack the beachhead. The result was extraordinary. The 1st Special Service Force, at its peak strength of roughly 1,800 men, held a sector of the Anzio perimeter that was originally assigned to an entire division of approximately 15,000 troops. They held it not by firepower, not by numbers, not by fortification, but by the simple, primal reality that no German unit wanted to be opposite the Black Devils. The FSSF sector was the one place on the Anzio beachhead where the enemy actively tried to avoid contact, and that avoidance freed up Allied resources for other sectors. But the Campaign of Terror came at a price that the glossy regimental histories tend to skim over. The night raids were extraordinarily dangerous. The forcemen who crossed the canal nightly were operating in small groups, in the dark, deep inside enemy territory, with no artillery support and no possibility of reinforcement if things went wrong. When a raid was detected, the fighting was ferocious and close range, and extraction under fire across open marshland was a nightmare. Casualties were not measured in the dramatic single battle tallies that make headlines. They accumulated steadily, night after night. A man here, 2 men there, a team that went out and simply never came back. Over the course of the Anzio campaign, the FSSF suffered a casualty rate that would have been classified as combat ineffective in any conventional unit. The difference was that the forcemen did not operate by conventional rules. Men who were wounded returned to the line before their injuries had fully healed, because they refused to leave their teammates short-handed. Officers led from the front to a degree that was almost suicidal. Robert Frederick himself was wounded 9 times during the war, a record that suggests less a commander and more a man who actively sought out the most dangerous point on the battlefield and inserted himself into it. The ethos of the FSSF was not serve your country or follow orders. It was do not let the man next to you down, and that ethos, forged in the hell of Montana training and tempered in the mountains of Italy, was strong enough to sustain a casualty rate that would have shattered any other unit in the Allied army. And the Germans knew this. Intelligence captured after the war reveals that the Wehrmacht's assessment of the FSSF was unique in the annals of the Second World War. The 1st Special Service Force was the only Allied unit during the Italian campaign that was consistently described in German intelligence reports as a formation whose combat effectiveness could not be reduced by normal attrition. Other units could be worn down, demoralized, broken by sustained pressure. The forcemen could not, because their replacements were trained to the same insane standard as the originals, and because the unit's identity was so strong that new men absorbed its culture within days of arrival. This brings us to the question that military historians have debated for 80 years, and that the polite Canadian national myth would rather not confront at all. The 1st Special Service Force had a reputation, documented in Allied and German sources alike, for being extraordinarily reluctant to take prisoners. The official records are carefully worded, as official records always are when the subject is uncomfortable, but the pattern is unmistakable. German units facing the FSSF learned very quickly that surrender was not a reliable survival strategy. Survivors of raids reported that the forcemen did not always give quarter, particularly in the chaos of a night assault, where the distinction between a man raising his hands and a man reaching for a weapon is measured in milliseconds and survival. Instinct. Was this a war crime? Was this a deliberate policy of frightfulness? Or was this the inevitable result of sending men trained as silent hunters into close quarters combat in total darkness, where hesitation means your own cessation, and the rules of engagement drafted by lawyers in Washington have no meaning whatsoever? The answer, almost certainly, is all 3, in varying proportions, that shifted with every raid, every night, every individual encounter. What is beyond dispute is that the German fear of the FSSF was grounded in something real, not mythological. The Black Devils earned their name not through propaganda, but through sustained, verifiable, nightly demonstrations that the rules of warfare as the Germans understood them did not apply in the FSSF sector. And this fear had strategic consequences far beyond the Mussolini Canal, When the Allies finally broke out of the Anzio beachhead in May of 1944, the FSSF was at the tip of the spear. The breakout operations saw the forcemen advance so rapidly that they outran their own supply lines, covering ground at a pace that left the conventional infantry divisions struggling to keep up. The FSSF was among the first Allied units to enter Rome on June 4, 1944, and the scenes in the Italian capital were surreal. Battle-hardened forcemen, still wearing their mud-caked uniforms and carrying their blood-stained V-42 stilettos, wading through crowds of cheering Romans who had no idea that the grinning soldiers tossing them chocolate bars and cigarettes were the same demons who had terrorized the German army for months. The liberation of Rome was the FSSF's greatest public triumph. But behind the celebration, a grim reality was taking shape. The unit had been in sustained combat since December of 1943, and the cumulative toll was staggering. The original complement of roughly 1,600 men had been nearly entirely replaced. Some positions had been filled and vacated 3 or 4 times as the original forcemen were wounded, evacuated, or simply disappeared on night raids from which they never returned. The unit's institutional knowledge, its irreplaceable core of Canadian wilderness experts and hardened Montana-trained operators, was being diluted with every passing week, and the replacement pipeline could not produce men of the same caliber fast. Enough. After Rome, the FSSF was transferred to southern France for Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of the Riviera coast in August of 1944. They performed brilliantly, as they always did, seizing the Ile d'Hyères in a ferocious amphibious assault and then driving inland along the French coast. But the writing was on the wall. The FSSF's unique capabilities, mountain warfare, night raiding, close quarters combat, were less critical in the open, mechanized warfare of the French campaign, and the unit's casualty rate had pushed it to the breaking point. On December 5, 1944, almost exactly 2 years after the assault on Monte la Difensa, the 1st Special Service Force was officially disbanded in a ceremony near Menton, on the French-Italian border. The Canadian and American contingents were separated and reassigned to their respective national armies. The Canadians, many of them, went to the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion and continued fighting in northwest Europe. The Americans were absorbed into the newly formed 474th Infantry Regiment. The numbers tell a story that no amount of official language can soften. Over the course of its operational life, the FSSF suffered a casualty rate of roughly 600%, meaning that the unit's total casualties, wounded, missing, and eliminated from the rolls, were approximately 6 times its original strength. The force had an unofficial kill ratio against the enemy that some historians estimate at 25-1, a figure so extraordinary that it has been questioned by scholars who suspect it includes the psychological casualties inflicted by the sticker campaign and the night raids. But the statistics, however dramatic, miss the real legacy of the 1st Special Service Force, which is not numerical but cultural. The FSSF was the direct ancestor of both the United States Special Forces, the Green Berets, and the Canadian Special Operations Regiment. The unit's motto, insignia, and traditions were adopted by the American Special Operations community, and the Green Berets trace their lineage directly to the forcemen of Montana, Difensa, and Anzio. The organizational model of the FSSF, small, highly trained, multi-skilled operators conducting unconventional warfare behind or beyond enemy lines, became the template for every Special Forces unit created by the Western democracies in the post-wars era. And here is the detail that should make every Canadian simultaneously proud and uncomfortable. The half of that DNA that made the FSSF special, the half that turned it from a collection of American troublemakers into the most feared fighting force in its The Mediterranean theatre was Canadian. It was the lumberjacks, the trappers, the hunters, and the miners of Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, and the Maritimes who brought the wilderness skills that no training camp could replicate. It was the Canadian volunteers who taught their American counterparts how to move silently through darkness, how to navigate without a compass, how to survive in conditions that would incapacitate a normal soldier within hours. And it was the Canadian tradition of the trench raider, inherited from the shock troops of Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele a generation earlier, that gave the FSSF its fundamental tactical philosophy. Get close, get violent, get gone. The world thinks of Canadians as the polite neighbours, the peacekeepers, the gentle giants of the international community. And that image is not entirely wrong, because Canada is, by almost any measure, one of the most tolerant, inclusive, and conflict-averse societies on the planet. But the image is incomplete. Beneath the politeness, beneath the multiculturalism and the universal healthcare and the reflexive apologies, there is a streak of cold, methodical ferocity that emerges when Canadians are pushed to the edge. And that streak has a pedigree that stretches back through the 1st Special Service Force, through the trench raiders of the First World War, through the frontiersmen who carved a nation out of the 2nd largest wilderness on Earth. The Germans at Anzio understood this, even if the rest of the world has forgotten. They did not call the Canadians polite. They did not call them nice. They called them black devils, and they meant it as a statement of fact, not an insult. Because in the darkness of the Italian marshes, with shoe polish on their faces and stilettos in their hands, the men from Alberta and British Columbia were not acting. They were not performing a role. They were being exactly what their upbringing and their landscape had made them: patient, silent, relentless, and absolutely without mercy when the moment demanded it. The stickers they left behind said, "The worst is yet to come." For the soldiers who found them, those words were not a threat, but a prophecy. And for the comfortable myth of Canadian niceness, the existence of the Black Devils is a reminder that the worst has already happened, that it happened in the service of the Allied cause, and that the men who did it were not monsters, but volunteers, who went home after the war and became farmers, teachers, mechanics, and grandfathers, never once apologizing for what they did in the dark. The question remains, and it is a question that has no clean answer. Was the terror justified? Were the night raids, the stickers, the refusal of quarter, were these things acceptable in a war against an enemy that was operating extermination camps and executing prisoners on an industrial scale? Or did the Black Devils cross a line that no cause, however righteous, can justify? The German soldiers at Anzio would have given you one answer. The survivors of Dachau and Buchenwald would have given you another. And the old men in Alberta and British Columbia, the ones who kept their V-42 stilettos in a drawer and never talked about the war, would have given you no answer at all, because some questions are not meant to be answered by the men who lived them, but by the generations that came after, in the safety and comfort that was purchased, in part by the willingness of polite, quiet Canadians to become something the world prefers not to acknowledge. They sent demons, not men. That is what the Germans said, and 80 years later, it remains the most accurate assessment of the first Special Service Force ever written. Not because the forcemen were supernatural, but because they were something more unsettling. Ordinary men from an ordinary country who discovered in the mountains and marshes of Italy that the line between civilization and savagery is not a wall, but a choice, and that when the stakes are high enough, the polite ones are the most dangerous of all. The next time someone tells you Canadians are too nice for war, remind them of Anzio. Remind them of Defensa. Remind them of the stickers. and then ask them this. If the nicest country in the world can produce the Black Devils, what does that tell you about what nice really means? The worst is yet to come.